Right, hello everybody and welcome to this video, which is another video looking at measurements of macroeconomic performance. Now in this video, what we're going to be focusing on is inflation. So hopefully what you can see on your screen right now is the key theory that you're expected to understand linked to inflation. So this video will talk you through all of this theory. Right guys, now what I would like to do please, can you start off by jotting down these questions and writing down your answers. So what you'll need to do is to hit pause once you've put down the questions, you put down your answers, and then once you've sorted, hit play and we'll talk through this theory. Right, so inflation then. Now it's worth just thinking about the difference between micro and macroeconomics. In microeconomics, we look at the prices of individual goods and services. So what do people pay to go to the cinema? What do people pay for a loaf of bread, etc.? In macroeconomics, we look at the general price level or the average price level. So what we're doing here, we're aggregating up all of the different goods and services that consumers spend their money on a regular basis. So this can be a useful way of measuring the cost of living increases over time. Right, so first of all, then inflation is a sustained increase in the general price level. So in other words, over time, most prices will increase of most goods and services. A few will occasionally fall. So when we look at the price of electronic items, for example, they're often cheaper today than what they were 20, 30 years ago. But generally, prices only move in one direction, and that is upwards. It's worth noting at this point here that our target rate of inflation, what we call price stability, is an annual 2% increase in prices. So what we tend to get is a monthly update on the current rate of inflation. So for example, if we were to get an inflation update for, let's say, July 2020, that will be comparing price levels in July 2020 with price levels in July 2019. So we calculate them every month on an annual basis. So when we get our month update, it's from the same month from the previous calendar year. So inflation is when price levels increase over time. Deflation is the opposite. So a sustained fall in the general price level. So in other words, this is when we have a negative rate of inflation. Okay, so inflation, prices are going up. Deflation, prices are going down. Now, disinflation is something that people often find a little bit confusing. Disinflation is when we have a fall in the rate of inflation. So this could be inflation falling from, let's say, 2% down to 1%, maybe down to 0.5%. So that means that prices are still going up, but the rate of growth of price levels is not as high as what it was previously. Okay, so you tend to get this when economies start to slow down, maybe moving towards recessions. Hyperinflation is where price levels increase by at least 50% per month. So that means they are in effect more than doubling every month or two. So a rapid growth in price levels over time. Shrinkflation is where businesses try to get around inflation or hide it from consumers. So what some businesses are aware is if you were to raise prices, then people notice that, and they might be concerned that it might raise demand. So sometimes when businesses have got increased cost of production and they want to maintain profit margins, or they simply fancy a bit more profit, rather than raising prices, they just give you a smaller product. Okay, so in effect, you're getting less chocolate for your money, etc. So a chocolate bar, rather than raising the price, they might give you a smaller chocolate bar. The same thing happens with crisps and other snack products, where the amount of crisps or sweets in the packet might go down rather than raising the prices. Okay, so you've got here the introductory key terms linked to inflation. Right, now we're going to be thinking about, why do we measure inflation? What is the purpose of measuring that increase in prices over time? Well, we looked earlier on in another video looking at economic growth, and what we said was that nominal GDP is just measuring at current prices how GDP increases over time. What we said though was that real GDP will factoring in the cost of living changes, so the rate of inflation. So if we want a good indication of how much money people have got in real terms, in terms of how many products they can buy with their money, then we need to know the rate of inflation to work that one out. So that's therefore means that inflation is a useful way of measuring how the cost of living is changing over time. Now that's really, really useful for businesses, so employers, but also employees to calculate their wage rate. So businesses have got to consider, is the wage that we're offering our workers fair? Or is it a livable wage? Well, to do that, we've got to be looking at the cost of living and how it changes over time. It also allows businesses to calculate budgets. So if they're planning on releasing a new product next year, they've got to be roughly aware what the cost will be of producing that product in a year's time. So what will it cost to buy the raw materials, the semi-finished products required to make that product? So that will therefore allow them to predict and plan of what their future prices and profitability will be. It also allows households to plan. So when people know how much money they're going to be earning each month, if they know what the rate of inflation is, they can predict what things will cost in the future, and that will allow them to adjust their family budgets to adapt to changing prices over time. They're also useful for the government. So governments employ lots of people in the public sector, so teachers, nurses, doctors, and you tend to find over time that wage rates will need to grow by the rate of inflation to allow for real wages to be protected for public sector workers. But they're also used to determine tax rates and benefit levels that people get. So people on old age pensions, unemployment benefits will hopefully regularly get inflation increases in how much they receive, and that will protect the real value of their benefits from the government. It's also used for tax rates. So income tax rates, for example, will be adjusted to take into account the cost of living. So a few years ago, if you earned more than £10,000 per year, you'd have to pay income tax. Well, that has been adjusted to roughly £12,500 before you pay income tax. And the reason why is it's clear today that £12,500 will buy you the same number of goods and services today as what £10,000 would have done, let's say 5 or 10 years ago. So again, it's about protecting the disposable income of households. It's also useful for the government to set budgets for public sector services. So, for example, if the costs of running the National Health Service increase over time, then budgets will need to be adjusted upwards to take into account that rate of inflation. It's also useful for measuring our international competitiveness. So let's say, for example, our price levels increase quicker than they do in other countries across the world. That would mean that relatively our prices are increasing faster than what they are elsewhere in the world. And that could be really, really bad for UK exports. It could mean that British firms struggle to compete, which means that we import more, and that could be quite bad for our economy. Right, so what I would now like to do, please, is to use diagrams to explain the difference between demand pull and cost push inflation. So again, write down the questions, jot down your answers, hit pause, obviously now. When you're finished, hit play again, please. Right, so you've got here then the causes of inflation. You've got the top two, which were the ones I gave you the question linked to, demand pull and cost push inflation. Now, demand pull inflation occurs when we have an increase in demand for goods and services across the economy. If you think about in a micro world, if you've drawn an outward shift in demand, then that would show demand pull inflation. That growth in demand will literally pull up prices. And that is because at the original price level, there is now an excess demand. So to clear that market and that scarcity, price levels will get bid upwards. If you used a macro diagram, you would show an outward shift in an aggregate demand curve. Now, cost push inflation is just linked to an increase in business costs. So businesses exist generally to make profits. So to work out profits, they look at their selling price, and then they will take away the cost of making that good or service. So if the costs increase, then they've got to raise prices to protect how much profit they're making when they sell goods and services. So, for example, firms have to pay wages to their workers. They have to pay for importing raw materials or semi-finished products. So car companies, for example, might import engine components, and there are other costs linked to distributing goods across the world. So high fuel costs, for example. There might be high taxes they've got to pay. Now, if these costs increase, then businesses will have to raise their prices. This will be shown in a micro world by an inward shift in a supply curve. In a macro world, by an inward shift in short-run aggregate supply. So everyone, demand pull inflation, outward shift in ADE or demand. Cost push inflation, inward shift in supply or SRAS. Right, other causes of inflation there, we have an expansion of money supply. Now, when you spend your money, it carries an opportunity cost, and that is the interest rate. So if you were to borrow money from a bank, if you want to demand that money, you've got to pay an interest rate. If you were to spend your savings, you sacrifice the interest rate that you get on it. This therefore means that the price of money is the interest rate. Now, what we know then is that if you were to increase the supply of anything, it will push the price downwards. So think about an outward shift in supply, prices fall. This therefore means if we were to increase the supply of money, it means there's an abundance of money sloshing around the economy. This will make money cheaper. So banks will lower interest rates, for example, if there's more money in circulation. This will mean that more of us will demand that money because it's now cheaper to borrow, or we're sacrificing less interest by spending it. And that will mean that we're spending more on goods and services. And that will also trigger demand pull inflation. Now, we also have something we call a wage price spiral. And this is where inflation can create more inflation. So let's say, for example, we have inflation in the economy. It could be demand pull, it could be cost push. Now, employees will then see that their income is buying less goods and services than what it was previously. This will therefore mean that workers will demand an additional pay rise to compensate for the increase in inflation. So, for example, if inflation was 5%, workers would demand a 5% pay rise to compensate for the growth in the cost of living. Now, what this will then do, it would lead to higher business costs, which means firms will then raise prices to compensate for paying their workers more money. Workers again notice that prices have increased, and they will then demand another pay rise, which will again inflate business costs even more, which means prices grow again, which means workers then again get a further pay rise. And this will then create a spiral of inflation. So prices growing means that wages have to grow. If wages grow, prices grow again, which means wage rates have to keep growing. And this is the start often of hyperinflation creeping into an economy. Right, what would I now like to do, please? Can you write down number 3? What I'm now looking for you to do, please, is to outline the effects of inflation. So what I'm looking for here is what do you think are the main causes of inflation in the economy? I beg your pardon, the effects of inflation. So what are the impacts of it on people? Right, so you've got here then the impacts of inflation on different economic agents across the economy. Now, the first one is diminishing the value of savings. Money in the bank. If there was no interest attached to it, then over time, the real value of them savings will fall. In other words, if you had £100 in the bank today, and that £100 was still £100 in a year's time, if there was inflation taking place across that time, that £100 would buy fewer goods and services in the future than what it would do now. So what you tend to find then is that inflation over time can erode the value of your money, which means that your future spending power will be lower. Now, this therefore means that often, if there's high inflation, people spend their savings now to maintain the value of that money. In other words, protects the value of their savings in the bank. It also means that interest rates will need to grow to incentivize people to save, and that interest rate will then protect the value of them savings against higher inflation. Another effect of inflation is shoe leather costs. And this is because at the moment, when inflation is low, people know what a fair price for a product is. So you know, for example, how much a can of pop should cost. You know how much a packet of chewing gum should cost, what bus fare should cost, etc. Now, when you've got high inflation in the economy, people lose track of what a fair price is for a certain good or a service. And that means more people are spending more time searching around for different prices to ensure they're paying a fair price for the products they're buying. This doesn't affect just consumers, but it also affects businesses who also have to buy from different firms, from suppliers, etc. So you've got all those additional costs and time that's wasted searching for good and fair prices. Another one is something we call menu costs. So if prices are increasing over time, then businesses have got to update their price lists. This could be restaurants having to pay for money to update their menus on cafe tables, on the signs above the place where you pay for the prices, but also it's the cost of updating all the machinery as well, vending machines, etc., to reflect the new prices in the economy. So this will bid up business costs when you've got more inflation. Now, a further one is reductions in real incomes. So when you have high inflation, if wage rates don't grow in relation to the inflation, then your spending power of your disposable income will fall. High inflation can also create discontent. So people who experience high inflation and see their living standards fall might strike from work in order to demand higher rates of pay. We also know that inflation would lead to a reduction in international competitiveness. So high inflation will mean that our price levels are growing at a quicker rate than what they are elsewhere in the world. And this could lower the demand for our exports, and this could worsen our trade performance. Now, an impact on the government is something that we call a fiscal drag. And this is where tax brackets have to be adjusted to compensate for changes in cost of living over time. So, for example, over time, we tend to see how much money you can earn before you pay. Bottom income tax rates will be adjusted upwards to compensate for this, to allow people to afford basic wants and needs. You can argue one benefit, though, of inflation is it reduces the real value of debt. So people that borrow to buy a house, etc., let's say their mortgage is £600. If you earn £1,000 a month, that mortgage is 60% of your monthly income. Well, with inflation and growing wage rates, over time your wage rates will increase, but the cost of your mortgage won't, which means that mortgage will become a smaller proportion of your income over time due to the effects of inflation. Right, everyone, what I would now like you to do again is to hit pause and write down the answers to these two questions, please. How do we calculate inflation? And then number 5, why is inflation very difficult to calculate? Once you've written down your answers, hit play again, and then we'll move on to the answers. Right, okay, everyone. Now, the most common way of calculating inflation is to use something we call the Consumer Price Index. Now, the Consumer Price Index is the most common form of measuring inflation in the UK. And you've got here a list of all the different things that we have to do to calculate the rate of inflation. So in an earlier video, we looked at what index number is. So what we would do, we would establish a base year. So our starting point from which we're going to make comparisons. What we then do, we identify a suitable basket of goods and services. Now, what we want to do, we want to know over time what is happening to people's cost of living. So we've got to make sure that the basket of goods that we select to measure inflation is representative of most households. So what we do, we conduct a survey called the Living Costs and Food Survey on an annual basis. And this will survey thousands of individual households to discover how much they spend and what they spend their money on each month. Now, what we can do with that information, then, we can use that to identify a suitable basket of goods and services. And then what we can then do on a monthly basis is to gather prices for these goods and services across the economy and across different regions across the country. We can then average these out, and then we can find a new index number. So over time, if there's inflation, the index number would increase. What we'd also do will be to attach weightings to these different goods and services. So what we want is the relative importance of these different products to be reflected within the basket of goods and services. So things that people spend a bigger proportion of their income on will have a much bigger weighting than things that people spend a smaller proportion of their income on. What we could then do, we can then find a final index number, and then from that we can calculate the inflation and therefore the cost of living increases over time. It's worth noting though that we've got to make sure that the basket of goods and the weightings are up to date. So over time we've got to update both of them to ensure that the basket is representative and reflects as many households as possible across the economy. Right, now you've got here a numerical example of how we would calculate inflation. So what we've got here, we've got 4 different years, 2017, 2018, 2019 and 2020. What I'm going to assume is, to make things simple, that in the basket of goods identified by the, if I go back a slide, you can see there, the living costs and food survey, there are only 3 products that people spend their money on a regular basis. You can then see the prices of these individual goods and services. What we've then done, we've calculated the weightings. So for example, product A is £10 and people spend on a monthly basis 50% of their money on product A. Product B, 30% of their money, and then product C, 20% of their money. Now what you can see I've done is I've updated the prices of these products for the next 4 years, the next 3 years, I beg your pardon. And what you can see is that prices are generally moving upwards over time. I've also updated the weightings to reflect the changes in consumer behaviour over time. Now what we would do, we would take the price in each year of each product and multiply it by the weightings. This would give us the cost of living. So for example, we can see that the cost of living in 2017 is £16. By 2020, it's grown to £16.46. Now what we'll do, we'll set 2017 equal to 100 index points. This is therefore the base year. Now what we can then see then is that by 2018, there's been a 26p increase in the cost of living. So what I would do to work out the new index number, I take the new price, which is £16.26, I divide it by the base price, 16, and multiply it by 100, which gives me an index number of 101.6. In 2019, we can see that the cost of living has increased by a further 4p. So again, we take the new price, £16.30, we divide it by the base, which was 16, multiply it by 100, and we get 101.9. We take the same process in 2020. So we take the new price, divide by the base price, multiply it by 100, and we get 102.9. Now hopefully what you can see then is between 2017 and 2020, there has been a 2.9% increase in the cost of living. We can use these numbers now to calculate the rate of inflation. So look what I've done. From 2017 to 2018, there's been a 1.6 growth in the index number. So I take the 1.6 growth, divide it by the previous index number, multiply it by 100 to get an inflation rate of 1.6%. So that means in 2018, price levels grew by 1.6%. In 2019, we would take the growth in the index number. So it's grown from 101.9 from 101.6. It's grown by 0.3. We divide by the previous index number, which is 101.6. Multiply it by 100, see that the cost of living or the inflation rate is 0.3%. In 2020, exactly the same thing again. The index number's grown by 1 from the previous year. We divide it by the index from the previous year, multiply it by 100, and get an inflation rate of 1%. Okay, so you can see there then that inflation rose the most in 2018, it rose the least in 2019. So people would use this data to set budgets for different goods and services, to use it as an indication of how much business should raise prices. Governments would use it to adjust tax brackets and budgets for public sector services. So lots and lots of really, really useful things we can use that data for. Right, now in reality, clearly people don't just buy 3 different products. So you've got here what the current basket of goods and services is divided up into. Now these will have lots of subcategories. So food and beverages, there are 22 different categories we would include under that heading. Alcohol and tobacco, there are 4. and you can see all the different big headings of different things which are included in the basket of goods and services. You can also see the current weightings. Okay, so the thing which is the highest weighting in this basket of goods is transport at 15.1% of income. Restaurants and hotels, 12.8%. Housing and household services, 12.6%. So remember, those weightings will be adjusted over time to reflect how important these things are to different households across the country. You can see here recent data for the Consumer Price Index. So if I look at March 2020, we can see that the index number was 108.6. So what I would do if I wanted to work out the inflation for 2020, I would compare that 108.6 against 107 from the previous year. So I would do 1.6, which is the growth, divide by 107, multiply it by 100, and that shows me that in March 2020 the inflation rate was 1.5%. Okay, so you can see here that generally inflation has been fairly stable. There have been some times when it's been too low, 0.3, 0.5%, etc. There have been times when it's been slightly too high, 3%, 3.1%. And we can see across 2020, this data suggests that we have disinflation. So the rate of growth in price levels is starting to fall. Right. It's worth noting, though, that there is a difference between something called the Consumer Price Index and the Retail Price Index. So there are two main measurements for inflation that you need to be aware about. The CPI is the most commonly used, but there is also something called the Retail Price Index. Now, the big difference is that the Retail Price Index will include mortgage interest payments and council tax, whereas the CPI doesn't. This therefore means that the Consumer Price Index is ignoring housing costs, whereas the Retail Price Index will include this. There's also differences in how it's calculated, and I'm not going to go into the mathematics behind it, but the big assumption is that the CPI is more accurate measurement of the cost of living than what the Retail Price Index is. Right, last slide, everyone. You've got limitations, though, when it comes to calculating inflation rates. So one big problem is that over time, product quality increases. This therefore means that when you measure how price levels change, it's very difficult because of changes in technology and quality. So, for example, if we include a mobile phone in the basket of goods in the year 2000 and compare a mobile phone today, then they are almost different products. So it's maybe not a like-for-like indicator of how prices are increasing over time. So when I think about a mobile phone from the year 2000, you could store maybe 12 messages on the phone. You could maybe ring people, send messages and play the odd game here or there. A mobile phone today is a glorified computer. You can watch videos, you can go on the internet, you can use the camera, you can download apps for it. Well, it's a very different product. And the same thing goes with TVs. Comparing the price of a TV today is not really fair when you look at what a TV was like 20 years ago. Very, very different products. We've also got to consider as well that we have shocks, which could either originate inside our economy or from outside our economy. And these can disrupt prices temporarily, and that can affect inflation. So let's say, for example, there was a sudden sharp increase in the cost of certain food items due to bad harvests across the world that would temporarily raise prices. Well, the problem is it's only a temporary disruption, and it's probably not a fair representative of the cost of living changes over time. What they will also do, that they will change spending patterns, which means that the basket of goods might not be accurate. So when you think about COVID-19, there's been a sudden growth in the demand for face masks, for hand gels, soap, etc. And that means that demand, the spending patterns have moved towards these products. Well, that means the basket of goods is now slightly out of date and maybe isn't an accurate measurement of the cost of living. Okay, so that therefore means that overall, the basket can be unrepresentative for most people at certain times of the year, depending on shocks. Now, finally, it can be unrepresentative in general. The basket of goods represents an average household. The weightings represent an average household. Well, that's not going to reflect everybody. So that means that for many people, you know, single parent households, potentially, wealthy people, extremely poor people, the basket will not represent those individual people. So the only real way of calculating inflation fairly would be for each individual person to have their own basket of goods and weightings. Okay, so it's a decent indicator of cost of living, but we've got to accept it's not perfect. Right, guys, there we go. That is the end of inflation.